Hello everyone, I'm Daz and welcome to American Civil War and UK History. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get your podcast from. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit that subscribe button and give us a big thumbs up. And to keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK history, check out our website where you'll find blog posts, podcasts and links to all of our social media pages. Links are available in the podcast description. Joining me today is historian and author Chris Kolakowski. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, Daz. How's it going?
Very well, thank you. And historian Tim Willging. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, Daz. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so 2025 marks a very important year as far as anniversaries are concerned, and that is probably one of the biggest, and that is the 80th anniversary of VE Day, Victory in Europe. And so I've got two very knowledgeable people about this period to come on and discuss the closing months of World War II in Europe. And so we're going to discuss some of those key events from January all the way up to the 8th of May, 1945. So we're going to start off, guys, with the end of the Battle of the Bulge, which is in January, 28th of January, 1945. And of course, the US take a pounding here, don't they? I'll start with you, Chris. Do you want to talk about the Battle of the Bulge and explain a little bit about it, please?
This is a whole episode in itself, Daz,
Exactly.
but I'll try and be quick.
Yes.
So it was, in some ways, Hitler's last gasp. Right in the winter of 1944, just before Christmas, December 16th, 1944, he commits 250,000 men and basically all the scraped up reserves that he can find to try and basically capture the port of Antwerp, attack through the Ardennes, capture the port of Antwerp, and try and at least delay some of the Allied advances in the West, if not split the Allied offensive by cutting off Bernard Law Montgomery's 21st Army Group from the rest of the Allied armies. They push in through the Ardennes. It's one of the it's called in many ways the greatest battle the U.S. Army's ever fought. It's certainly one of the largest, if not the largest by some measures. If you want to see how Americans fight with their backs against the wall, there are many places in the Ardennes that give you good examples of that. At the same time, they bought the time necessary. They delayed the German timetable long enough for other American reserves and British reserves, I might add. British 30 Corps and 6 Airborne got involved to both stop the Germans short of the River Meuse. And then over the course of basically the month of January, the battle is considered going from 16 December 1944 through 28 January 1945, eliminate the salient. And then by that point, they're ready to resume the offensive into Germany proper.
Okay. Tim, would you like to talk a little bit about the Battle of the Bulge?
I think Chris did a great job on it. I think one of the more interesting things is that it revealed, in addition to, the fighting prowess of the Americans, it did reveal that some of they were still working out some of the kinks in Allied command also that had, I wouldn't say been plaguing it, but it was an issue. At the onset, Montgomery actually advocated that, I think Chris can correct me if I'm wrong, but was still advocating for unified command with one ground commander other than just having Eisenhower do it. Yep. He actually felt like he needed to take control over part of the offensive, and I think he took over the U.S. 9th Army, control of it was 9th or 1st, I forget which.
Actually, he did both. He took both.
Oh, he took 9th and 1st,
right.
Leaving basically Bradley in command of Patton in 3rd Army. So that was a bitter pill for Omar Bradley to swallow. And to my knowledge, I don't think Bradley ever really forgave Montgomery for that. And to an extent, he harbored some resentment because he felt like it was passing judgment on him. And some commanders really did deserve a little bit of scrutiny. Who was in command at the headquarters? Was at Bastogne originally. Name skip. It wasn't Simpson.
No, that would have been. Are you thinking of Troy Middleton of 8th Corps? Or are you thinking of Courtney Hodges?
Troy Middleton, who was actually pretty good up till then, but he was a little too passive. He kept his command, but he's gotten some scrutiny in recent years from the likes of Peter Caddick Adams and others who have shined the light that he had his deficiencies, whereas other commanders stepped up. Kevin Himmel's excellent book demonstrated that no, Patton did not actually predict the bulge. That's a long-standing myth. His intelligence officer, great intelligence officer Oscar Koch, did say that there were indications that something was brewing, but it never went so far. It turns out that Patton's wife had doctored his diary after the war, potentially with the aid of some of Patton's aides during the war to make him look even more brilliant than he was. But Patton during the bulge really was brilliant. The counterattacking ability to rapidly change directions is, people say, oh, instead of going this way, you should go north instead. Or we need you to go north and do it by this date. There's a lot involved there, rerouting of your logistics and formations, and the ability to rapidly do that. And then Eisenhower performed well. While he underestimated German capabilities, he responded very effectively in pushing reinforcements, containing the attack. And then after basically German forward progress ended, it was really just a matter of snuffing it out, trying to close the gaps, because it set them up for perfect encirclement. So while bloody, it set up the Allies, because it was an Allied fight, even though that's America's biggest battle and all that. It was a supreme Allied effort that shortened the end of the war, because, as they said, I think it was Eisenhower or maybe it was Patton said we should let them go to Paris, stick their neck out, and that's really what happened. The Germans were irrevocably damaged beyond recovery after that.
Excellent. Thanks for adding that. And I just want to say as well, guys, and you might agree with me, you probably will, is if you want to get a little bit of a sense of what it was like during Bastogne, watch Band of Brothers, because there's two great episodes. Two of my favourite episodes, actually, are set in Bastogne, and they're just amazing. Agree. Absolutely amazing. And I get a bit choked up when you hear the veterans talking after one of those episodes, I believe, when he says about the cold. You get a real sense of how miserable it was for them over that month or so, couple of months. I just want to go back to, you mentioned Adolf Hitler there. So obviously we know at this point he's controlling a lot of the military decisions, isn't he? Now they're being squeezed really heavily on both sides, aren't they, by the Soviets, by the Allies. And so what is the German High Command's thinking at this point with him, throwing his weight around and trying to take control of everything all the time? Chris?
So by this point as 1945 is dawning, Adolf Hitler is firmly in harness, as he's the head of the German state, he's the chancellor, he's the head of the Nazi party, he's commander-in-chief of the armed forces and commander of the German army. And there's a couple other titles as well that I'm forgetting at the point, but you get the idea. He basically is in complete control. And that is also augmented by the repression that has happened after the failed 20th of July 1944 assassination attempt, which is depicted very well in the movie Valkyrie. That really stifled all further opposition. People, if you opposed him, you could pay with your head. Famous figures like Erwin Rommel got caught up into that dragnet as well. There were some others. So Adolf Hitler, basically, the Germany is dancing to Hitler's tune as completely as it can, as completely as it does in the 12-year existence of the Third Reich. And that also means that Hitler's doctrine, from a military standpoint, his doctrine of fanatical resistance. If the offensive fails in the case of the Ardennes, he forbade withdrawal from the Bulge, stand and die, and that fanatical resistance, that will to win, will win out at the end. It's proven to be produced decidedly mixed results in previous years, particularly on the Eastern Front. But nonetheless, that's what Hitler continues to hold to. He looks at the map. If you're a German and you look at the situation map on the 1st of January 1945, you notice that the Allies don't really hold a lot of Germany proper. The Allied tides coming at Germany from east and from west are lapping up against the German border, and they've crossed it in a few places in East Prussia and Aachen and in the west. But that's about the only good thing on the situation maps, because bombing has really damaged production. In fact, this U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey would say after February 1945, Nazi Germany was no longer considered an industrial nation. So, the German economy, the German railways, it's all about to collapse. And it's going to produce very dramatic effects over the first 5 months or so in 1945. But nonetheless, as 1945 dawns, Adolf Hitler is in full harness, and the war machine is still working to his will.
Yeah, and like you said, he keeps a lot of, because he's so suspicious of everyone. He keeps his circle quite small, doesn't he? As well, I believe.
Very much, very much.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm glad you brought up the bombing there, because I'm going to bring that up next. So obviously in February 1945, they are going to unleash hell on Germany. I mean, they have been anyway, haven't they? But Dresden is one of those cities that really, really suffers incendiary bombs, I believe. And there's a British guy called Bomber Harris, who gets a bit of a bad rap, doesn't he? For some of these raids, and they're really bad. But they're getting ready for a big offensive, aren't they, across the Rhine? So they have to do something. So is this part of that thinking, Chris?
Dresden is a complicated case. The strategic air offensive, let me give a little bit of context here. The strategic air offensive in 1945 was bombing oil, they were bombing industry, and they were also especially targeting transportation. And one of the reasons was that they were trying to disrupt German troop movements, particularly at this point. There's an order as the Russians by this point, people forget, are only 50 miles away from Dresden at this point. They're on the Oder River. There's a chance they might take Berlin by February, March. They don't, because they want to secure their flanks in other parts of the front and then make a final concerted drive. But to aid that, Dresden is one of the few unbombed rail junctions that's left. And so Bomber Command and then 8th Air Force over a series of days reduced the city to what you see here. The book Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, he survived that as a prisoner of war in Dresden. And one of the things that makes it controversial is that the Nazis actually inflated the casualty figures. They said the often cited six-figure casualty figure has since been disproven. It's actually it's still bad. 25,000 dead over 3 days. It's still bad, but it's not the six figures that you'll see in some sources. But also coming as it does at the end of the war, in a city that has been largely untouched at this point and is full of refugees, German refugees that have fled the Russians, it creates controversy. And it's a controversy that started immediately after practically immediately after the bombing, and continues actually to this day. One of the things, the sources of that controversy is Harris himself, because Harris, whereas the Americans tried as much as they could, and their doctrine was much more industry, transportation, civilian casualties were side of that. Harris made absolutely no bones about targeting the cities and targeting the workers as part of the war effort. And that was controversial at the time, and it remains controversial to this day.
It's a little bit like Total War in a way, I suppose. A little bit like Sherman's type of thinking, bring the American Civil War into it, but it was similar, wasn't it?
It is. It's the question of how much is the economy of an enemy country a legitimate military target? And when you go after an economy, that also means you're probably going after civilians. You take, for example, the Dam Busters raid, targeting the power source and water source for part of the Ruhr industrial area. Things like that. Are those legitimate military targets? In some ways, because of World War II, there are now treaties, there are now certain laws and morals in place. For example, the targeting of dams today is considered a war crime. It wasn't at the time,
Mhm.
but it's one of those where people look at what we're actually unleashing. We have the power to unleash, and this is even before the atomic bombs are exploded in July of 1945. Look at what we can do. We shouldn't do this to ourselves again if we can avoid it. And let's try and put a regime and put some rules in place. 1949 Geneva Convention, some of the other treaties that have followed since.
And again, I don't mean to bring up the modern day, but some of that stuff that you mentioned there about the laws against it has gone on in recent years in a certain conflict. I'm not going to name the conflict. Everyone knows what
Yeah.
conflict that is. But yeah, it's great you brought that up. Now, is there any thinking from the British side of things, the fact that Germany had been pounding Britain for so long? And again, a lot of the citizens and cities of Britain were completely, hammered by the Germans for quite some time. So is there a little bit of payback there sort of in the thinking there? I know it sounds the wrong thing to say maybe, but what do you think about that?
No, I think there is something to that. And it's not just, it's also the people forget that the baby blitz, as it's known, in early 1944, and then, of course, the V1, V2 strikes on London go on almost till the end of the war. So, there is something to that. Plus, you're starting to get, German atrocities are being revealed. There's the true nature of the enemy, which has long been suspected, as we've come across France and come up the Italian boot and are starting to get into Germany proper, are becoming very clear. And I've actually heard people say that had the Russians had our strategic air force, they would have done Dresden to every single German city because the Germans did that to them in the war in the East. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
there's definitely an emotional component to it, Daz.
Yeah.
Sorry, Tim. I don't know if you have anything to
No,
add on.
yeah. Tim, do you want to add anything to all this, mate?
Oh, I absolutely think there's a lot of tit for tat, as it were, and the British were continuing to suffer under V1s, V2s well into 1945. But I think the comparison with what the Russians would have done is an apt one. Whether they had our strategic air force or, God forbid, the atomic bomb. And you see a lot of that when you get to the Battle of Berlin. There's a lot of similarities. Berlin is treated very similarly to how the Germans had treated captured Soviet cities. Leningrad, Stalingrad's destroyed. Granted, that was in battle, but the atrocities committed on the Eastern Front generated a lot of retribution when the Soviets advanced into East Prussia, German occupied Poland, moving into Germany proper. I guess the saving grace there for the Germans or the German people was that the Americans and British had occupied most of Germany. So that kind of saved them to a degree, but by no means total. I mean, look at Dresden and all of that. I mean, Germany was wrecked, and I think I've always loved the quote, that Germany had basically ceased to be an industrialized nation. Such was the efficacy of Allied strategic bombing.
Yeah, and it boggles my mind. It was only 80 years ago because that is not long, is it? Really isn't. Okay, let's talk about the Battle of Cologne. So in early March, Tim, do you want to start with that one, mate, and explain a little bit about the Battle of Cologne?
Yeah, sure. So, kind of setting the stage a little bit. So after the Bulge, a couple things happened. Speaking to Hitler's preeminence in German strategic planning. Or German military operations in total. After the Bulge, he orders another offensive, and that's through Alsace. That's Operation Northwind. It kicks off first week of January. You get some great stories out of that. Like end of the month, you have outside the city of Holtzwihr, you have Lieutenant Audie Murphy conducting his heroics on the back of a burning tank destroyer fighting off a German counterattack. That's part of the reduction of the Colmar pocket there in Alsace. But by February, the Germans are in basically full retreat out of the Bulge. The Allies are trying to encircle them in the Ruhr pocket. Arnhem will finally fall in 1945. It took that long after Market Garden. But in Cologne, that was, Cologne was the fourth largest city in Germany and the largest city on the Rhine River. So given that the Allies were, during this period, the main theme was getting crossings across the Rhine, Cologne was big. It also was very sentimental. Had one of the largest cathedrals in Europe, and it actually survived, and that's rather remarkable. Three different Allied American columns were approaching Cologne from three different directions: the 3rd Armored Division, the 104th Infantry Division, and the 9th. The 3rd is probably best known, and there's a great book written about it. It's all about a tank crew, one of the first tank crews to receive the M26 Sherman tank. That was the gunner on that was a guy named Clarence Smoyer. Chris, who wrote that book? His name's escaping me. Spearhead.
I'm blanking on it too, but I know the one you're talking about. Yeah,
it's a phenomenal book called Spearhead. Adam Makos.
Yeah,
wrote it, talking about their experiences. Smoyer was, just a private soldier. Had served in a Sherman until it was knocked out, and then he got another one. Was put in a different crew because much of his crew had been killed when his Sherman was knocked out. He was a phenomenal gunner, did a demonstration with the new Pershing tank, which had increased armor. It was America's first heavy tank in response to, American tank doctrine was always that tanks weren't supposed to fight other tanks. It was supposed to be used for penetration. But Shermans, while mobile and easy to repair and all that, were definitely inferior in terms of firepower and armor to German tanks, the Tiger 1, Tiger 2, and the Panther. So what's most notable is an engagement that took place in the vicinity of the Cologne Cathedral, which is there in the picture on the right in the background, where this Pershing actually knocked out a German Panther. And it was actually recorded on video. There's still photos of it that you see here. So that actually kind of validated the Pershing's status. But ultimately, Cologne's basically wrecked. Fortunately, the cathedral survived, and they were able to trap a significant number of German troops. Unfortunately, the Wehrmacht was able to destroy the Hohenzollern Bridge, which was the last link between the east and west part of Cologne, which spanned the river. So what that basically directly led into the next battle, which was the Battle of Remagen, because the Allies were still looking for bridges to get across the Rhine.
Yeah. And so, do you want to add anything about Cologne and Remagen, Chris, about those two?
I think Tim summed it up really well. I'll just say, just in general about the Rhineland campaign, Hitler's generals, we talked about Hitler's stand fast. What that army, the Western Army, was badly damaged, as we've discussed, after the Ardennes. And then Hitler ordered it to stand fast west of the Rhine, basically between the German border and the Rhine River, of which Cologne was one of the last, as Tim said, was one of the last strong points, major strong points to fall. That defeat really hollowed out the forces in the West. And even when they are able to get back to the Rhine, they are a shell of what they were. You'll see pins on the map that say division. You're lucky if it's a battalion strength in some cases. And that's a result of, the stand fast and let's not give up. Let's fight for every inch of ground. Um,
They're very good at knocking out bridges, though. So
Yeah. So
German engineering. Yeah.
yeah. So let's bring up obviously Operation Plunder as it's known, and that is the crossing of the Rhine. Give us an idea of what faces that Allied forces of getting across this river, because it's a huge river, isn't it, Chris?
The Rhine in that area is anywhere from 900 feet to 1,500 feet wide. And it's got there's enough of a current that it can be a concern at that point in March. Is March 24th is when they, not either 23rd, 24th March is when they open Operation Plunder. Um, the river's also somewhat tidal in that area, but it's also deep enough. At its shallowest in that area, it's 9 feet deep. So you can use landing craft. You can use a bunch of different options. An amphibious operation across there is possible. Um, and Bernard Law Montgomery is given the main effort to do just that. And I actually found some statistics that from the Army, U.S. Army official history that summarizes, just gives you an idea of the scale of Operation Plunder. Let's see. The British alone marshaled 60,000 tons of ammunition, 30,000 tons of engineer stores, and 28,000 tons of other commodities, all in addition to normal daily requirements. That's the British. U.S. Ninth Army in support built up another 138,000 tons of supplies. More than 37,000 British engineers were to participate, and 22,000 Americans, including Canadian units. The British had 3,411 artillery pieces, anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns supporting it with rocket projectors, and the Americans had another 2,070. And that includes naval personnel, because a lot of those landing craft, you can see a photo there on the left of a Rhine River crossing. A lot of those landing craft were brought from the Normandy beaches or brought from the Channel. And so you will have naval participation. In some ways, it's the largest amphibious invasion in Europe since Normandy, if you by certain measures. And it's all designed to get Montgomery and his forces across north of the Ruhr industrial complex, from which point they can then break out into the northern European plain and just rampage across Germany and finish off. They mortally wounded the German army west of the Rhine, but this will be the opportunity to get the final kill. They just have to get over the river, and that's what Montgomery plans to do.
Mm-hmm. And again, you always hear the saying that, oh, there's only old men and kids left defending Germany, but that's not the case, is it?
There were a lot of old men and kids, but there was also a lot of fanatical. I shouldn't say a lot of, but it was spotty. Some places, it wouldn't be much. Other places it would. It all depended on the commander, the sense of duty, the sense of mission, sense of desperation. There was actually one of the things people don't realize is around the Ruhr, the Germans were able to adapt all the flak guns that they had set up to shoot at aircraft over the years, shoot at the strategic bombers. They then put along the riverbank in artillery positions, the 88s, and used them as artillery. They didn't have enough of them. They also didn't have enough time to really build a strong defense in depth. So once you were able to get through the first line or two on the eastern riverbank, then you were able to get inland. And we also dropped airborne units that helped fight our way through. But plunder within 36, 48 hours is an unqualified success. And from that point on, it's just a matter of getting the troops, getting the bridges built, getting the troops across the river, and then it's time to plunge eastward.
Yeah. So, Tim, what would you like to tell us about Plunder? Your thoughts?
So, a couple things. Like, if you take it back to just before the bulge, the Allied supply situation on the Western Front was spotty. They were still having issues getting fuel, ammunition, troops to the front. Just not enough resources to go around. But by March, they're able to pull this off with all the landing craft engineer assets, ammunition, fuel for the ground forces. And on top of that, you've got the Allied Airborne Army engaged in the largest single day airborne operation. They dropped 16,000 airborne troops in Operation Varsity, which is supporting plunder, from the 6th Airborne and 17th British 6th Airborne and U.S. 17th Airborne Division, which was their major combat action of the war. The 6th had been in Normandy, I believe. But, you know, the fact that they were able to resource all of that, and conduct, you know, fight the Battle of the Bulge, fight off Operation Northwind, you're still engaged up in the Ruhr pocket, is really remarkable. And then Operation Varsity itself, you know, it was costly. They suffered several thousand casualties in each of the two Allied divisions, but they captured 3,500 German forces. And once again, these are blows that Germany just can't sustain. So it really was an unqualified success, as much logistically as operationally. And I think that's worth highlighting, is that you have these guys, these supply troops and commanders that keep logistics on the front of their mind. These efforts are often overlooked, and I think it really does a disservice to our understanding of the war when we undercut the role of logistics, because without the beans and bullets, so to speak, the troops can't move forward.
Mm-hmm. And I love this photograph, and because it's pontoon bridge, and of course, you know, we're Civil War fans, so we know how important those pontoons were, yeah. And it's amazing photo. Now, this is my favourite one. Now, you're going to like this, guys. This is Winston Churchill after coming, and he's there, you know, in person. No, it's a great photo to find of crossing the Rhine. There you go.
I love that photo, and
Yeah,
I'm glad you brought that up. It shows you the emphasis placed on plunder. The fact that Churchill was there, Eisenhower was there, although he's not in the photo. Behind Churchill is the chief of the Imperial General Staff, Allenbrook, Field Marshal Allenbrook, later Lord Allenbrook. Over Churchill's left shoulder is Field Marshal Montgomery, and then some of the American commanders in the back, including the tall one there on the far left in a dark jacket. That's Ninth Army Commander William Simpson. So, you know, there was a galaxy of VIPs that were accompanying or were witnessing this operation for sure.
And
unfortunately, I think we only hear about Varsity, and that the other elements, the amphibious crossings, frequently get overlooked, which I think is really unfortunate, because the operation Varsity was only a component. It was much bigger than that.
What I love about this photo is really captured Churchill's excitement of getting out of that craft, and you can really tell he looks like a school kid that's, you know, really excited to going up that bank, and which you can understand. But I just love that. You know, when I came across that, I was like, I've got to have that. Anyway, let's talk about the encirclement of the Ruhr pocket, and so they get surrounded now, don't they? So, Tim, do you want to start off with this, mate?
Well, that had been, you know, getting into the Ruhr had been an objective part of Operation Market Garden. So, you know, the goal was you accomplish the crossing of the Rhine at Arnhem, and then you pivot into Ruhr, and that's crucial because those cities, you know, Dortmund is probably the most exceptional of that. Or the most significant city in the Ruhr. You have a lot of German factories. Actually, today it's got it's kind of known. It's got several beer factories or breweries in that area that are notable, for those who are interested in that. But getting across, you have some units that have been famous in the war engaged there, and I think by this stage of war, they frequently get left out. The 29th Infantry Division is engaged in fighting in the Ruhr pocket, or in eliminating the Ruhr pocket, yet you don't really hear much about them after Normandy, after especially, you know, notably the capture of Saint-Lô and Normandy. Then they go into Brittany, but then they're sent into the Netherlands And if you're reading about the war and the most popular text, you don't really hear much about them. But the Germans know they need the Ruhr just because that's where a lot of their industry is. So it becomes a major Allied target. And they've kind of built themselves into a salient. So the Allies are trying to pinch it out from, as the map shows, multiple directions. They're attacking across the Rhine. They're attacking from north and south. And I forget, it's the remnants of German Army Group B that's stuck in the Ruhr pocket. So you eliminate that. You basically have eliminated the defenses for the entirety of northern Germany, in addition to the reduction on industry of German industrial capacity. Sorry. So it's a big operation as well that also is sadly overlooked.
Chris, do you want to add something there, mate?
I think Tim summed it up really well. The Ruhr was, by some measures, 2/3 of the German industrial output. Second only to Berlin, this was the objective of the Allied armies, and we can talk about Berlin in a little bit and some of the decisions that were made on that. But and Tim's absolutely right. The destruction of Army Group B is one of the largest single surrenders of Germans in the war, short of Germany itself surrendering, and really tore out the center of the German front. And from this point on, the Allies are going to be pushing across Germany against much less opposition than they faced west of the Rhine. That's for sure.
Okay, let's bring up another topic now. And so Roosevelt passes away on April the 12th, 1945. How big of a loss is that? And obviously, the world's dealing with World War II at the moment, but in particular in America, how is this taken when this guy passes away? Chris?
It was a profound shock. Roosevelt had been president for 12 years. And if you were born in the 1920s, so in other words, if you were a young soldier in Europe at this point in the American Army or in the Navy or in the Air Force, Army Air Force, the only president you probably remember is Franklin Roosevelt. So for a lot of people, it's sort of like the Queen. The way what the Queen was for many generations, Queen Elizabeth II was for many generations when she passed. She had been the one everybody knew. For particularly that younger generation, that was the case. Franklin Roosevelt also dying when he does. He's been leading through the war, leading through the Great Depression. There's a tremendous shock in a lot of ways. As a matter of fact, his name. Several newspapers would print casualties every day, casualty numbers. And on April 13th, it was Commander-in-Chief 1, next of kin, Eleanor Roosevelt, Hyde Park, New York, just like everybody else. So that tells you how he was regarded as enmeshed, as kind of inseparable to the U.S. prosecution of the war. However, the war is so far along, at least in Europe at this point, events are carrying along, that it doesn't have a tremendous impact on the war, because the war has he dies April 12th, the war has less than a month to run when Germany surrenders May 7th. They signed the surrender on May 7th. So it'll have a bigger effect in the Pacific and in the post-war world, but at least for an immediate impact in Europe, it's some very sad news, but the armies are going to press forward and finish the job.
How does Churchill, and what was Churchill's relationship like with Roosevelt? How does that news reaching him affect him?
Oh, it affected him greatly. The closeness that Churchill and Roosevelt had is very well documented. The multiple wartime meetings that they had, the extremely close and frequent communication that they had. I will say at the end there was a little bit of an ebb, and this is kind of one of the subtexts and Hitler was kind of counting on this. He was hoping that there might be a fracture in the alliance at some point. It never happened, but as the Allies are pushing into Germany, Roosevelt and Churchill are starting to get at loggerheads, and by the way, de Gaulle, because everybody's starting to maneuver for the post-war world. At least the European powers are. The British are looking ahead to the post-war world. The French are looking to reestablish some power and an occupation soaring. You know, you see some of the impacts, particularly at Stuttgart, and some of the maneuverings of the First French Army are designed to restore some French prestige on the continent of Europe. But Roosevelt is looking at this and realizing we've still got a war to fight against Japan, which is also true of Churchill to a certain degree. But we still have a war to fight against Japan. We need to, and that's going to affect some strategic decisions and some debates, particularly over whether the Western Allies should try to go to Berlin and Prague and Vienna. And ultimately, those armies are held back. And part of that, Roosevelt is still alive for those decisions, and he has influence on that. And that's really probably one of the last influential things he has on the war. But those debates are going on, and those debates don't end, and those debates still go on in the history books today.
Mm-hmm. Tim, anything to say on Franklin Roosevelt?
I think Chris summed it up really well. The impact was operationally, and especially in the Western theater was minimal, unfortunately. You had different, I think Stephen Ambrose and Band of Brothers highlighted Winters and others said, that he was the only president that they ever really knew. So they were shocked in that sense, but it didn't impact them. The operations as much, because really by that point, the war is almost over and inertia is just going to carry it through. But the shock, he was central to the two biggest events in the U.S. of the 20th century up to that point. The Depression and his response to that via the New Deal, and then leading the country through World War II. And I think what's been more as interesting as or intense as the reaction in the States was at the time, the debates over FDR that have resulted since, what was he more successful at, the civil stuff with the New Deal or serving in commander-in-chief, has generated a lot of really interesting debates in the years since.
Okay, let's talk about the following day, and that is the Soviet Union captures Vienna. Tim, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So ever since basically Stalingrad, in 1943, the Soviets have been on a constant push. You have major engagements such as Kursk and others. But by this point in 1945, they're basically on German territory. Austria is a German-speaking country, so they're at the gates of Vienna. They're approaching the gates of Berlin. The Vienna offensive was launched by actually the two different Ukrainian elements, the second and third Ukrainian fronts. It had been bombed for over a year prior to the Soviets' arrival. And they basically, it had been determined that, Stalin had met with the Western Allies prior to April concerning basically who was going to go take what. And it was determined that the Soviets would lead the offensive against Austria, and there would be that the Soviets would occupy a large part of that country. It's also significant there because, and I'm not sure to what extent Stalin knew this, maybe Chris could clarify during his remarks, but, Hitler was actually an Austrian and he spent a considerable amount of time in Vienna, so it was sentimental to him. So to have the Soviets take it is kind of like, hey, you didn't take my namesake city, but I took your hometown. So that was a big feather in Stalin's cap and a big win for the Soviets.
Yeah, Chris, would you like to add something?
I think that's spot on. Vienna, even today, is a cultural center. And when you think about the fact that for the generation that is the senior officers and the national leaders that were the Roosevelt, Stalin, some of the generals, what have you, they remember the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It is a very recent memory. You know, it only went away in 1918, and so here we are just over 25 years later. And so Vienna has a tremendous stamp from a psychological standpoint. It has a tremendous impact. And then the Anschluss, you know, and the impact that Vienna and the Austrians had, and also Austria's support, which is a source of controversy today in Austria, but Austria's support for the Nazi war effort. One of the Second Panzer Division in the German army was from Vienna. So there is a psychological. This is one of those psychological blows. This also, you know, you have Roosevelt dying April 12th. You have the first concentration camp, real serious major concentration camp liberations around the same time with Buchenwald, Ohrdruf, and then Bergen-Belsen. So you're getting these big reveals of the Holocaust by the Western armies. The Eastern armies have already overrun Auschwitz and what have you. And then you get the taking of Vienna. So within this basically 3 or 4 day period, it's a huge boost to the Allies. And for any Germans that still thought they might actually win the war, it's clear that that's not going to be the case. And this is just a major milestone in the road that's the final defeat of Nazi Germany.
Mhm. Okay, I'm going to bring another battle in now. And Tim, do you want to tell us about the Battle of Seelow Heights?
So Seelow Heights is really interesting because it's really in essence, one of the last major pitched battles in the European theater of operations. It's fought largely by, ultimately the unit that comes out with the most attention is this element of the Red Army known as the First Belarusian Front. They're the ones who finally break through the Seelow Heights. But the Seelow Heights was the last major defensive line east of Berlin. The battle itself wasn't like Normandy fought over weeks. This was a 4-day battle from the 16th to the 19th of April. Featured 1 million Soviet soldiers, 20,000 tanks and artillery pieces against about 100,000 German soldiers and 1,200 tanks. The objective was to break through to the gates of Berlin. And ultimately, the Soviets were successful. And after that, they're basically in Berlin. However, they suffered over 30,000 dead. So, and the Germans had less men. They suffered 12,000 dead, plus, additional wounded. But basically, by winning the Battle of Seelow Heights, the Soviets basically sealed the German state. It's only, 11 days before Hitler dies, and less than 3 weeks before Germany surrenders. So that's really the Germans' last ditch effort to keep the Soviets out of Berlin, and it fails.
Mm-hmm. And I believe on the 18th of April, all resistance in the Ruhr ends as well, with 370,000 Germans, prisoners of war, being taken. So, Chris, tell us about how important that day was for everyone involved.
So it was huge. It eliminated Army Group B had a outstanding fighting reputation all the way back actually to 1942 in Stalingrad. It had been in some of the more prominent battles, and some of the more prominent units and generals, including some that had fought the British in North Africa, long service officers, get rounded up among those 370,000 and are marched off into captivity. It tears the guts out of the German Western Front, and from that point on, the Germans, there's some forces to the north, there's some forces to the south, and for all the other Americans that are pushing east toward the Russians, toward central Germany, if they run into opposition, it's scattered, and primarily at that point it becomes just a drive. It's a driving exercise. Um, but these, I mean, 370,000 Germans surrendering, that tells you what you need to know right there.
Mm-hmm.
It's if you look at the order of battle of Army Group B when in the rear pocket, it is some of the more famous formations in the German army, and they're just wiped off the map.
And bringing back Band of Brothers, there's also that huge scene, isn't there, where they're advancing to Germany, and you get this massive column of German soldiers marching the opposite way. So if you want to get a sense of that, ladies and gentlemen, seriously watch that TV show because you will get a real sense of that. I'm just going to bring up now as well that Hitler at this point in April the 22nd, decides to stay in Berlin till the end of the war, down in his little bunker. And the Americans and the Soviets are going to meet each other, aren't they? Tell us about that, Tim.
The meeting at the Elbe is what's called. So basically, that is where forces from, is it Simpson's army?
It's Hodge's army, 69th Division, First Army.
Okay, so yep, the German or the Americans and the Soviets meet. It's a militarily, I guess it was inevitable. No one was really surprised by it, but just showing this symbolic nature that the two fronts have met, so therefore Germany really is done is what it sends. I've always found it ironic because it's a matter of weeks before the two are in effect opponents in the Cold War. Granted, it doesn't transition, but looking at it, with hindsight, you're looking at that and it's like, okay, we're shaking hands, but in short order after that, the West and the Soviets are ideological opponents pretty much as soon as Germany surrenders. So you look back at that and it's like, oh, very brief period of friendship.
Chris?
It's tremendously symbolic because at that point, the Russians and the Americans, just the symbolism of it. And the symbolism of that photograph is on the left there is speaks for itself. By the way, coincidentally, as director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, I have to point this out. The second in from the left is from Wisconsin. And the officer that is standing kind of in the background on the Soviet side settled in Milwaukee after the war.
Wow.
So, yeah, that's a fun little fact. But you notice on the map there, notice where they all stopped. The American forces all stopped. The Ninth Army at Magdeburg, Simpson's army up there, where they had wanted to go to Berlin and were stopped. That's one of the reasons Eisenhower chose to stop on the Elbe and then the Mulde River, is because it's a good, easy line. There was a lot of real concern, language barrier, communication barrier, all kinds of things, as these armies approached each other. Friendly fire incidences, the whole bit, and would it create issues? And there were already tensions, particularly with the Polish uprising the year before and how Stalin treated that. There's already cracks in so let's not exacerbate and let's not have a friendly fire incident right on the end of the war. In some ways, the Cold War had actually probably already begun. It had first echoes. But at least this day, on April 25th, all that stuff is forgotten in the pure joy of these campaigners that, hey, the troops in front of us are friendly for the first time for the first time in years, in some cases.
Yeah, great point. And again, 30th of April, the Soviet troops are less than 500 meters from Adolf Hitler's bunker. And that is the next big thing. And it is huge. And Hitler kills himself. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that, Chris, about what happens there?
So Adolf Hitler had decided that he was going to stay in Berlin and fight on and basically die a soldier's death at that point. He writes his last will and testament, and marries his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, and names all of his successors. Goebbels will be chancellor. He Karl Dönitz, the great Grand Admiral, basically because he's one of the ones that you talked earlier, Daz, about the kind of narrow circle of intimates that he felt like he could trust, and Dönitz was the one. So he says, "You're going to be the new Führer of the Reich," and he hands out a few others as well. Um, and then late in the afternoon of April 30th, he and his now wife disappear into his private quarters in the bunker. And by some accounts, a shot rang out. By other accounts, they didn't hear anything. But within a few minutes, they went in, and Eva Braun has taken poison. Hitler has taken poison and shot himself. And then their bodies are burned outside the bunker, and then buried, later recovered by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. But yeah, that's actually a really good map of the Fuhrer bunker, which has now been filled in central Berlin. But you can see what a complex it was.
Yeah.
But also how small it was when you consider the amount of people. If you watch the movie Downfall, which is considered to be probably the most accurate portrayal of the last week or so in the Fuhrer bunker, you get a feel for how claustrophobic this is. And then it's a great photo there on the left. You can see even in the bunker there was some luxury to it.
Yeah, and again, at this point, he's lost his marbles anyway, hasn't he? He's just not thinking straight at all. I mean, you can see it in some of the footage in the later with shaking, and because I think he's dependent on, is it painkillers and things like that? His doctor's drugging him up, and there's all sorts going on, isn't there?
Painkillers, latent injuries from surviving the 20th of July bomb plot. There's that famous, the kind of the last public appearance on April 20th when he goes out to Berlin and decorates some of the Hitler Youth. What they don't show is that he's holding his left arm because it's trembling so much. He's walking with a shuffle. And Goebbels, the propaganda people, edit that as best they can to try and show him in some good health. But he's a wreck. He's a wreck from a lot of standpoints. One of them being the burden that he imposed on himself for many years, holding that many jobs as long as he did.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is a what if. Now, what if the Soviets had got a hold of Hitler? What do you think would have happened to him? Would they have, do you think, murdered him there and then, or would they have taken him back to Russia as some kind of prize?
Oh, he would have gone back as a prize. Stalin would have wanted to think of what Stalin did during the purges with his perceived enemies in the party and the show trials of the late 30s, and the way he would make a big public spectacle of humiliating them and basically showing his power and grinding them under his heel. If he did that in the purges of the late 30s, and even in the trial of the 16 with the Poles in 1945, can you imagine how much more he would have done with Hitler and the opportunity that would have presented him? Absolutely. Hitler would have headed the list of war criminals, whether he was tried in Moscow or whether he ended up heading the dock in Nuremberg. Either way, they would have publicly made an example of him.
Mm-hmm. Tim, anything to add about Hitler's death?
No, I mean, I think I think the only thing Chris didn't talk about was the addition to Eva Braun and himself dying. He also killed his dog.
They tried out the poison to make sure it would work on their dog. You're welcome to make of that what you will.
And again, I don't mean to bring it up, guys, but there's these conspiracy theories that he went to Argentina. I don't believe any of that. I'm sorry.
Bosh.
No, exactly. But again, so he was buried. So the bones, they actually found the bones, did they? The Russians? Did you say, Chris?
This came out. There's some reporting. Hugh Trevor Roper had done some digging in the 70s and got into the NKVD files. After the war, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it became more clear what actually happened. I think part of his skull is still in the archives in Moscow somewhere. Wow. But the Russians exhumed, actually did the test, identified the bodies, and then reburied them in an unmarked grave for years, actually in an old Russian motor pool in a base near Magdeburg. if memory serves correctly. But the Russians, back to your question, Stalin was extremely interested in finding Hitler, finding out what happened to him, and let's get this taken care of type thing. And so there were NKVD teams that were following right behind the secret police teams, coming right behind the Russian troops, and they went right into the bunker as early as less than 48 hours after the suicide. So, it was a priority for the Russians. It was a priority for the Soviets, and they were able to solve the mystery.
And again, sorry, so how long after did the Soviets the German army then surrender, the Seventh Army surrender to the Soviets?
German army formalized the surrender of Berlin May 2nd.
Yeah.
And then the photograph on the right, though, is the raising over the Reichstag, and that was actually April 30th or 29th, if memory serves correctly. But the formal surrender of the city was the morning of May 2nd, 1945.
And I mean, just from this picture alone, you can just see the absolute devastation of Berlin.
There's a lot of similarities with Stalingrad.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right, Tim.
Very powerful, isn't it? Okay, let's talk about again, so you get the surrender. Let's talk about the 7th of May, which is probably one of the most important days in the 20th century in history, and that is, of course, the signing of the surrender by Admiral Karl Dönitz. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, Chris?
So this is actually a culmination point. The Germans had been hanging on. As far as they were concerned, the Russians were the most dire threat. And so you get a lot of forces. The forces in Italy surrender on May 2nd to the British and the Americans. Montgomery accepts the surrender of the forces in Holland and up on the Baltic coast on May 4th. But it becomes clear to the Western Allies at that point that the Germans are trying to make a separate peace, a de facto separate peace with the Western Allies, which is something that Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin had all agreed was not going to happen. So they called the German representatives to Reims in France, to Eisenhower's headquarters. And the Germans are trying to negotiate and hem and haw, because what they're trying to do is buy as much time as they can for the armies facing the Soviets to get west and surrender to the Americans. Ike realizes this, and he communicates to the German representatives and says, look, if you don't sign these documents, I will close my front line to any refugees. And so the Germans radio back to Dönitz, and Dönitz says, well, if that's the best we can do, let's sign. And so in the early morning hours of May 7th, the Germans signed the surrender. They have a public ceremony at Russian insistence correctly the next day in Berlin. The surrender takes effect at 11:01 p.m. Central Europe time on May 8th. Because Moscow is an hour ahead of Central Europe, that means it's 1 minute past midnight on May 9th, which even today, the Russians celebrate Victory Day on May 9th, whereas all the rest of the Allied countries recognize May 8th as VE Day.
Wow.
And so it's an interesting impact, unforeseen impact on memory of the war.
Mm-hmm. Tim, do you want to add anything on the surrender?
One interesting fact to me was who signed which document. For the major German field commanders, particularly in the West, whether it was Rommel, von Rundstedt, Model, two individuals were kind of the bane of their existence, and that was Colonel General Jodl and Field Marshal Keitel. Jodl was the one who signed in Reims, and Keitel signed in Berlin on the 8th. Both of them would be tried at Nuremberg. But the fact that it was those two who had, been the bane, that one, they survived Hitler, and two, they were forced to actually sign the capitulation documents. I always found that interesting.
Yeah. And you're going to love this picture. If you like the one of Churchill before, you're going to love this one. So there he is, sitting on the chair. I believe, was that from the bunker, I believe? Something like that, I think I read. Yep. And I just love it. You could just see the look on his face. It's like having a great time, isn't he? Even though it's, horrible circumstances, but you can see the humour there. I love it. I think that's so iconic. It's like, because I mean, Churchill was pushed, wasn't he, by a lot of people in Parliament at the beginning to, to agree some kind of truce with Germany, wasn't he? And he stood fast and said, no, we're not going to give in to this guy, and we're not going to give up. And that is just one of my favourites. So yeah,
I
get your
It's a
thoughts on
tremendous
that.
human moment.
I find it very interesting because there's a very intriguing parallel there. That Churchill's seeking to sit in Hitler's chair kind of as like a conquering thing. Ironically, what was it, 80 years before? So 160 years ago now, we just commemorated Lincoln touring captured Richmond, where he went to White House at Confederacy and was directed to Jefferson Davis's chair. So it seems to be something, Lincoln was the chief, was commander in chief of the Union war effort. And in a lot of ways, Churchill was kind of the World War II equivalent. Yes, Roosevelt was the Americans had become predominant by this point in 1945, but Winston Churchill was kind of the heart and soul of the war effort against Nazi Germany. From a political standpoint, Eisenhower had been liaising with him. Yet he's seeking to show the same sort of thing that Lincoln was. So I think there's a very interesting parallel there.
It is. And again, a lot of people might not know it, but I know you guys will. He was a huge American Civil War fan anyway. He visited a lot of the battlefields, and he even wrote articles on the Civil War. He wrote an alternate ending if Robert E. Lee had won the war or something like that. So, he probably wasn't thinking like that because, obviously there's a lot going on. But yeah, great. I didn't really think about it like that, Tim. That's really good. Okay, let's talk about one of the most important things, and that is the celebrations. And again, in the US, it's a little bit, it's still huge, isn't it? But again, and in Britain, I suppose, as well, but you're still fighting Japan. So is it a little bit bittersweet at this point, Chris?
I would say yes. Is everybody happy that Germany has been defeated? Absolutely. But there's a recognition that Japan is still out there. As a matter of fact, victory in Europe happens during the Seventh War Loan Drive. If you've seen the movie or you're familiar with the story, the Iwo Jima flag raisers, they are parading around the United States trying to raise money and get war bonds, sell war bonds. Immediately after German surrender, within a month, Patton, Jimmy Doolittle, and several other notable personalities will come back for several weeks to help sell war bonds as well. So while everybody's happy that the war in Europe is over, there is a very real realization that this is not done by any stretch of the imagination, and it's the avenging Pearl Harbor is still a mission that requires completion. Which is a whole talk for a whole other time.
Oh yes, 100%. Tim, anything you want to add a little bit there about the US celebrations of the
I don't think it's there's thousands of people celebrating in Times Square. There's photos there, New Orleans, throughout the country, people are happy. But even in the US, a lot of people ask, well, we have VE Day here or Victory Day in Europe and in Russia and elsewhere. Does the U.S. have anything like that? And the answer is really no. People who are historically inclined may know it's VE Day and make a deal out of it, but the war wasn't over because we were a major partner in both Eastern or both the Pacific and Western theaters, but we were arguably the chief prosecutor of the war effort in the Pacific, and that was still going. That was the theater that brought us into the global conflict. So it wasn't over.
Yeah, and again, for a lot of the troops that are in Europe, it's not over for them either because a lot of them are going to be shipped out east, aren't they?
Or they think they are. The different formations are tagged for service. The 101st at one point was going to be sent to the Pacific. Different commanders were jockeying to go. Patton wanted to go. nobody knew whether they were going to stay in Europe or go. I think the only one who was reasonably sure he was staying was Eisenhower. Chris, correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yeah, pretty much. Everybody else was up for a potential. In fact, if you look at the correspondence between MacArthur and Marshall in the spring and summer of 1945, they're discussing every major commander, Army level and above for sure, and some corps commanders are being made available to MacArthur, whoever he wants, for the invasion of Japan. And people assume and are planning that the war in the Pacific is going to go into 1946, if not 1947. So, this is not, nobody knew the war was going to end in August of 1945 against Japan. So there's this whole thing about, the United States is looking at it from that perspective.
And the British also, I mean, I don't want, but, they've been fighting, especially in the Chinese, Burma, India theater and elsewhere where the Americans have had a play, but not as big as the British Army. The British are cycling commanders back east, formations. I think we pay attention to, the 101st is going to go, but the British were having those discussions too, I believe, Chris.
That's right. Actually, to put a fine point on that, there were third division, which made its name in Normandy, and Dunkirk before that was on the troop list for the invasion of Japan. There were other units that were on their way to the Far East. Bomber Command was on its way to the Far East. And Miles Dempsey, who commanded Second Army in Operation Plunder, was actually the designate commander for 14th Army. When they bumped Slim up, they promoted him. Dempsey was going to lead the invasion of Malaya in September 1945 to go and avenge the defeat of Singapore. So the British, we talk about the Americans. The British are having that same flow, as are the Canadians. The 3rd Canadian Division is on the troop list for the invasion of Japan as well. So, for several allies, one war is done. There's still another enemy out there that needs to be subdued.
I think it should just be said that how we treat the various V-days is based on how each country, what they viewed as, I'm talking the populace, not the planners or the politicians, but the populace. There's no question in Britain, while everybody knew that they were also at war with Japan, the primary opponent for the British people was, and all of Europe, was Nazi Germany. In the U.S., it's a little bit more complex, and part of that's also, ethnicity. A good chunk, if not the majority of Americans at that time, were of German American descent. That kind of played into it. But the fact is that what brought America into war was Pearl Harbor. So you would not get a uniform answer on who the chief opponent is of the United States in World War II back, during the war. So I think that speaks to the discrepancy between how the U.S. celebrated the victory days versus how Europe and elsewhere had.
Mm-hmm. And, I can confirm that obviously the British people did really celebrate that day. As you probably know, you've probably seen even the Queen apparently snuck out of Buckingham Palace, although she was a princess at the time, and went out and celebrated and and just celebrated. And of course, there were street parties and all sorts of stuff going on. And even when we had the 70s, there was another street party in the 90s, I believe. Other street parties when we had another celebration. I remember that as a kid. But yeah, it was heavily celebrated, obviously here. But then again, they were being bombed and attacked all the time. So for the populace, it was quite a relief that finally that part of it's over. And again, you made some good points there, Tim, about all of that. But let's talk about rebuilding Europe and how that's going to look going forward now that Nazi Germany has been defeated, Chris.
Europe is wrecked. Europe is absolutely wrecked. This photograph is of a German city, but it is replicated in other cities to varying degrees all over Europe. from the Ural, from the farthest reaches of the German army and the Soviet Union, all the way to the west to the Channel. Britain is on wartime rationing until 1955. This is why when you look at the state of infrastructure and the state of the economies of most of these Western powers, that's why the Marshall Plan in 1947 is so critical, is the infusion of cash to help with the physical, but also the economic rebuilding. Think about all the bombing we talked about in the rail lines. We had done the same thing in France in 1944 in the advance of the Normandy invasion. That has impacts post-war, and it's a huge thing. And so the U.S. support really helps becomes kind of the foundation of NATO, but also the Russians not wanting to risk a third invasion from Europe in the 1 century, begin to create, they call them buffer states, but I have thoughts on that. First of all, they redraw the map. The modern map of Europe was drawn immediately after World War II. So when you look at a map of Europe today, it's 1945. Germany, a lot of German territory becomes Polish. Some of it becomes Russian. That's why you still have the Kaliningrad Oblast enclave today, because Stalin wanted a warm water, ice-free port on the Baltic. And there was population transfers. It was all that displacement. It took the continent a lot of years. But the other thing that the Russians do and the Soviets do is they begin to create communist states and impose communist governments on the states that the countries the Red Army has advanced through. And so by 1950, Europe is effectively divided. Churchill, of course, famously describes it as the Iron Curtain that comes down over the center of Europe, and he's absolutely right. But it also means that it keeps that displacement going. I don't know if I can make a personal comment. My grandfather was in the Polish army in 1939. In 1945, he'd married a British woman. They had a choice whether to go to the United States or whether they could have stayed in Britain if they wanted to, but after the war, they didn't want to, or he could go back to Poland and live under the communists. His friends and colleagues that did that disappeared. He came to the United States. And so that division of Europe, the destruction, the dislocation of Europe, I use my family as an exemplar. There are a lot of people that are living in different places or have had effects of think of all the Holocaust survivors that later settled in Israel or settled in other countries. All of that ripples through the generations going forward. And it marks Europe to this day. The memory of the war marks Europe and European politics to this day. I know that's probably a way too cosmic answer for you, Daz, but it shows how this war remade the world. And by the way, just on a quick note, that's not my opinion. That's their opinion. The U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1944 said, when the war is over, it will, and this is very close to a quotation, it will be a change in the world comparable only to the fall of Rome 1,500 years before.
Wow.
So, yeah.
No, great points, my friend. And Tim, anything to add about the, and again, we're still reaping, some of those things are still going on today, aren't they? But yeah, Tim, anything to add about that?
So I think a couple interesting points, the Russians, and the major Allied leaders, Churchill, Stalin, and Truman meet about 9 weeks after Germany surrenders at Potsdam. They agree on pursuing the unconditional surrender of Japan. But they also, Stalin basically says he's going to expel ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe. That includes areas that have been central to German nationalism and German identity for, hundreds, if not thousands of years, namely East, West Prussia, Pomerania, areas that were part of, the Kingdom of Prussia. But most significantly was East and West Prussia. This is the territory of Frederick the Great and others, central to German nationalism. And, these are major cities, including Danzig and others that are no longer German. Um, I don't think that we can speak about that too much. That was, German nationalism and national identity was what brought all this on. And no place symbolized that more. The Junker class of Prussian military officers that formed the background of German, or formed the heart of German militarism in the 20th century. Now their homeland's gone. East and West Prussia hasn't been German for 80 years. That is an effect of the Second World War in the aftermath of World War II that I don't think actually is spoken about too much. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, guys. So,
No, I don't hear much about that. Yeah,
No, there's not. A lot of it is the Iron Curtain because it
Mhm.
was not discussed. It was just not a topic that was discussed. It's still very sensitive to this day, particularly in where the borders have changed, and they changed very quickly. The new frontiers of Poland, the current frontiers of Poland, took effect July 4th, 1945. So, Tim, you're absolutely right. But it's still a very sensitive topic today.
And I'll bring up another point as well. I don't know where I heard this, but I heard it somewhere that in Russia, in this communist Soviet Union at the time, they were taught a very different history of the end of World War II as well. And so a lot of people weren't taught about D-Day because it was coming from a Russian perspective, and they wanted, their story in a way. And, so there's that aspect as well. Like you said, the Iron Curtain came down, and that they believed what they believed, or what they were told. So yeah, it's a very interesting topic that you could get really delve deep into over cigar and beers. Definitely. Fantastic. So one thing we're going to talk quickly about the important Nuremberg trials. And again, this is important, isn't it? And, tell us a little bit about that, Chris.
So the Nuremberg trials. This was the first of a series of trials of various parts of both the German government, but also German industry, held in the years after the war. The most famous of which is this one, in Nuremberg. They were all held in Nuremberg, 1945-46, and this is the senior surviving members of the Third Reich. You can see Hermann Goering there in the dock, looking with his hand out. Next to him is the old deputy Führer Hess. Next to him is the foreign minister, and then the high command and a bunch of other luminaries. This is really important because this is one of the first times that there's an establishment of international law and there's a trial of this nature. There will be something similar with the Japanese in Tokyo. In many ways, the Geneva Conventions of 1949, a lot of the international legal structure that we have for how warfare is to be conducted, what a crime against humanity is. For example, if you think about the precedents of the war crimes trials after the Bosnia Wars, well, the Serbs, and Milosevic and his henchmen, they are using the precedents of Nuremberg, 1945, 1946. And so from a legal standpoint and from a moral standpoint, because not only is this holding them legally to account, but morally it is creating a record of what Nazi Germany was, what it did, and we can't ever have this happen again. We can't do this to ourselves again. And so this actually, we won on the battlefield. Now it's time to win legally, ethically, and morally as well. And that's what Nuremberg does.
Hmm. And I believe Goering commits suicide, doesn't he, during the trial?
He does. Well, he was found guilty, and a couple of days before he was to be hanged, he had cyanide smuggled in and committed suicide.
Yeah. Tim, anything you want to add about the Nuremberg trials?
no, I think Chris summed it up. There was maybe Chris remembers the title. I think he's better in films than I am. There was a mini series, I think it was, done with Alec Baldwin playing Justice Jackson, who was one of the prosecutors. That was actually done really well. Cox played Goering, and I think did a really good job.
Yeah, it was a TNT miniseries. The other one is the Spencer Tracy film Judgment at Nuremberg.
Yes. So I think those two actually have kept it in public mind, but it's also led to the perception that that was the only trial. And there was a lot more. I think it's also really interesting who they charged. You have political leaders in there, military leaders, but you also had industrial figures who kind of transcended both. And I always found it interesting that Speer was in that dock with the likes of, Keitel, Jodl, Goering, Hess. And Hess had been waiting for quite a while because he had jumped ship early, right? And
Yeah,
they
he'd flown to
brought him
Britain in
back.
May of 1941, had been in British custody.
Yeah, he landed in Scotland, I believe, and then was taken to the Tower of London, believe it or not. I believe.
That's right. Yeah.
So I kind of like that photo. Just looking at Hess, he looks kind of miffed that he's there at all.
Yeah. And there are some Germans, though, that don't go on trial and end up in America, and they create the space rocket. So these are a handful of scientists that are taken to the US, and we have them to thank for the space rocket. But I think what's your take on that, guys?
So that's largely, I think we're talking Operation Paperclip, which was several, well over 1,000. I think it was 1,500 or slightly more scientists. Werner von Braun, who was basically head of the German rocket development efforts, was involved in the V program, V1, V2s, was brought over and became, the chief scientist heading the development of U.S. rockets. I think Saturn V and all that. So it was central, these German scientists who had been developing these advanced technologies that Hitler, boasted about his war-winning vision, came over here and powered NASA on our quest to achieve dominance in space, win the space race to the moon and elsewhere. So
it is an interesting period, yeah. And again, that's that Cold War period as well, isn't it? Chris, any comments about the space race there quickly?
I think Tim hit it well. I would just simply add that von Braun and his team had a meeting in February 1945, and who are we going to surrender to? And there was a small group that wanted to go to the Russians, and they ended up going. And the Russians basically used their knowledge and then sent them away. But everybody, a vast majority, wanted to surrender to the Americans because they said the one country that is going to be able to allow us to continue our work is the Americans. And it's an interesting, von Braun and these people are very interesting from a scientific standpoint, but also from an ethical standpoint when you think about the concentration camp at Dora Mittelbau and the slave labor that they used to build the V2s. And it's an interesting, just when you consider the scope of a life and you consider the impact somebody has to both create the V2, but then also I don't think we'd be on the moon without the people in this Operation Paperclip photograph. So, how do you work that? How do you reconcile that? What does that look like? And how do you unpack that ethically? And everybody has to come to their own conclusion. It raises a lot of questions. But at the same time, I have to give von Braun credit for realizing I've got something special here in me and my team, and who's best, where should we best go? Part of it's to save his own skin, but part of it also is thinking ahead, and there's something to that. And it's an interesting, if you read there's several books on it about how the Allies had teams trying to find these guys, and then these guys trying to find the Allies, and how they were able to make contact in the waning days of the war, is really something interesting.
It is an interesting story, and it's something that I've delved into recently myself. So yeah, from documentaries and everything, So yeah, go on. Sorry, Tim.
From like von Braun, speaking of to Chris' point about the complexity of dealing with them, we have to mention von Braun was a committed Nazi. He was, by most accounts, he was also a member of the Allgemeine SS. So part of the larger SS organization. So he most definitely was a Nazi, but we have to recognize that and all that comes with it, the slave labor to build the rockets. And like Chris said, but at the same time here in the U.S., without him and his colleagues, we don't achieve what we did, getting into space. And if we didn't get into space, where are we at with the satellites and issues we have today, or things that we need today? So while we have to look at it, it speaks to this larger issue in the field, that humans aren't one dimensional, that history and historical figures are complex. I guess that's all I got on that one. It's, and it transcends this field, study World War II, and you look at it in other fields, or other subjects in history, and you see equally complex figures. It's not black and white.
Yeah. And I'm just going to bring this up now, guys, and I just want to remind everyone that this is a very, very important thing to remember, that there was a lot of people that died in this conflict so that we could be free today and live our lives the way we do. So, we owe these people so much, our ancestors, our relatives. If, like Chris had relatives in the war, stuff like that, Tim probably did as well. I did as well, so just remember all those people on the 8th of May. If you're listening to this on the 8th of May, just remember those people and take a couple of minutes to remember those people. And I'm going to bring up this now because Chris mentioned it earlier, and we're just going to leave it there. And this is for another time. And that gives you everything you need to know. And if you're listening on audio, you'll have to come over to see what I'm talking about. Anyway, guys, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. We could talk about this all day long. And to be honest with you, there's about 50 million podcasts in one podcast there that you could potentially go down. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
It was good to chat with you, Daz.
And all that is left to say, ladies and gentlemen, is cheers.